Before I get started, I'd like to kindly ask that you hit the like button and please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe. To some, this has been the gold standard for movie franchises for the last 10 plus years. Each year, they would pump out at least 2 to 3 movies in which they would all receive almost universal praise, both from critics and fans alike. Now, I will admit that I've been hard on this franchise for some time now, but truth be told, there was a time when I was actually invested in these movies, just like everyone else. Through much of Phase 1, I'm talking pre-Disney here, I could barely contain my excitement over the prospect of all these individual adventures eventually building to one bigger story. That bigger story would of course be the team-up movie that would eventually become the Avengers. And up until this point, this was the first time that comic book movies were approached in this manner. And it felt refreshing to have all these individual adventures connected by an overarching story, much like what happens in the comic books.
That makes sense.
And honestly, throughout Phase 1, I thought Paramount handled this concept brilliantly. This was of course before the evil empire of Disney came around and changed the trajectory of these films forever. Disney took these properties and actually doubled down on what Paramount and those directors were doing. They took an already working formula that was basically established in Iron Man 1, a great superhero movie by the way, and used that same philosophy and same tactics over the next 10 years for every single movie that they would eventually make. You see, the quirky humor works for Iron Man because that's Tony Stark, that's who he is. He's an arrogant, sarcastic prick, and it works for him. Little did we know, the MCU under the Disney banner would apply the same character traits and story beats that were established in Iron Man 1 to every single movie that they would make from that point on. I remember 2015 specifically as the moment when I put on my They Live sunglasses in regards to the MCU formula.
Our impulses are being redirected. We are living in an artificially induced state of consciousness that resembles sleep.
As I sat in the theater and I watched the ridiculousness that was Age of Ultron, it became very clear to me that Disney no longer had incentive to make bold choices with these characters and stories. There was absolutely no reason for them to try anything new because the audience was already hooked.
No shit.
This movie featured reactionary side stories for characters like Hawkeye, who they clearly didn't think was important enough a character in the previous Avengers movie to give a proper origin story before introducing him. They had what should have been a badass evil robot in the form of Ultron, who ended up being nothing more than a joke machine, and an evil Tony Stark clone. I think this is around the time when they also started using cringeworthy comedy to diffuse any serious situation in a movie.
Had you ever heard of the healing power of laughter?
And I strongly believe this was done to appease viewers with short attention spans. But all it really did for me was kind of overshadow the story that they were trying to tell and completely remove stakes from any of the on-screen confrontations. And this was my major problem with Infinity War and Endgame as well. You know, like how all the diehards pretended that the snap actually meant something, but knowing that half the characters who disappeared already had movie deals moving forward really kind of put a damper on that, even if no one really wants to admit it.
Fool this man!
Or there's moments in Infinity War like when Gamora and Star-Lord are having a nice tender moment with each other, only to have it ruined by Drax's peeping Tom comedy. Or how the first 20 minutes of Endgame actually felt dire and like it was high stakes, only for the rest of the movie to be boiled down to fat Thor jokes, an absolutely horrible rendition of the Hulk, a woman's empowerment moment in the middle of the final battle, and the most half-assed time travel plot ever put on screen.
That's right, it stinks!
Come to think of it, that's been another calling card of the MCU, where the beginning portions of these films feel like there's a genuine attempt being made, only for them to resort back to the tried and true formula around the second act. So it was over this time that I noticed these trends, like forced comedy, tensionless action sequences, basic storytelling, and forgettable characters. Yet for years, critics and fans would continue to praise these films and basically ignore all the flaws that I thought were very apparent.
Why?
Now, I'm not saying that these films are all unwatchable, I'm just saying that the universal praise for them came off a bit phony to me. It was as if people were trying to portray these popcorn movies as cinematic masterpieces, which they clearly are not. Now, there's no denying their success, I can't even argue against the box office. But I can argue that these films' success actually did a disservice to the film industry as a whole. Because now, because of that success, every studio wanted to run their franchise just like Marvel does. Disney themselves are included in that with the Star Wars franchise. At some point, creativity took a backseat to following a formula. A formula that really only worked for the MCU, at least financially. So as a result, all the films outside of the MCU either failed due to poor execution of that formula, or because viewers were somehow programmed into believing that this was the only way to do things, the Marvel way. And any movie that didn't do things the Marvel way was discarded.
I'm having trouble.
Fast forward to present day, and now the latest entry in the MCU, The Eternals, was officially released. It's very clear that they were trying to take the Guardians of the Galaxy approach with this movie, basically taking lesser known characters in the comics and trying to turn them into household names. Except this time, it hasn't exactly had the same effect. Eternals has been met with mixed to negative reviews from critics.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Now, some would argue that means nothing, and in a normal situation, I would happen to agree. But this is no normal situation. For one, for years now, MCU diehards would typically use things like the Rotten Tomatoes scores to justify the quality of the MCU films. But now, when the Rotten Tomatoes score for this movie is low, they want to completely disregard the critic's opinion. That's red flag number one.
My, how the tables have turned.
Second, I think it's very telling that these same critics, who would typically say nothing but positive things about Marvel movies, felt so strongly about the poor quality of the Eternals that they had to actually fight their natural instincts to give an unjustifiable, overwhelmingly positive review to this movie. You know, like they normally would. There's even been questions about the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes for this film fluctuating uncharacteristically. Some conspiracy theorists even claim that this movie is being positively review bombed or review boosted to try to change the perception of this movie. That is going through a lot of work to try to justify an objectively poor product.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
You even have shill news outlets like Variety and some hack writer named Clayton Davis who is suggesting that The Eternals is experiencing bad reviews because, quote, anytime a woman takes on the action genre, people come harder at that filmmaker.
Take a big step back and literally fuck your own face!
First off, the Rotten Tomatoes score for The Hurt Locker, Wonder Woman, Birds of Prey, and even Black Widow would suggest otherwise. All of those films were actually received positively on Rotten Tomatoes by both critics and audiences, and they were all directed by female directors. The fact that the shills are starting to pull the misogyny card for the MCU's first real critical disaster should tell you everything you need to know. It's become desperation time, because now it's clear that Marvel can no longer do no wrong.
This is fucking great, man! Now what the fuck are we supposed to do?
The fact of the matter is that Eternals features bland characters and uninspiring storytelling that they tried to mask with forced diversity. Because everyone knows what happens if you dare to criticize a movie that's diverse. Basically, when you promote a movie as that, you have a built-in excuse. And even now, the critics have to agree, representation isn't everything. You still have to have some kind of depth or personality behind those characters to make the audience give a shit.
I don't care!
Marvel, outside of Captain Marvel of course, has never really had to resort to pulling these divisive cards. Because up until this point, everything has been sunshine and rainbows. Everyone bought into everything they did. The fact that they are doing this now is showing cracks in the armor and showing that they are running out of ideas. It's also very telling that Disney, in a lot of ways, has actually abandoned this film in many foreign markets, because they know that certain audiences around the world are even less likely to accept the Eternals. The United States was their one sure thing that's no longer become a sure thing.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
Now, I could end this video here, but I have one more story to share because it's relevant. Dave Buatista, who I'm not really a fan of to be honest, came out recently and was talking about his role in Dune and how it was a blessing for him. He says, quote, I'm not just a guy in Guardians walking around shirtless and saying stupid shit. The Dune role gives me the opportunity to just play these like really deep characters. Now, I wouldn't call his role in Dune deep necessarily, at least not yet, but I would agree that Dune is a considerably more well-made movie than most Marvel movies, and Dave is clearly expressing that his role of Drax in Guardians of the Galaxy was very underwhelming for him as an actor, which honestly I can completely understand. Like I've already stated, the MCU typically treats their characters like walking joke machines.
Ha ha, very funny, motherfucker!
And usually incapable of expressing any kind of deeper emotion. Now, it's one thing for me to say this, and I've been saying it for years, but this is the star of one of these movies coming out and expressing his displeasure with the Marvel formula. Once again, being involved in these movies does not allow creative people to be creative. If you sign on for an MCU film, you must be prepared to be placed in a box that you will not be allowed to think outside of. It's really starting to feel like the Marvel empire is starting to crumble. In the past, we would have never had this many critics or actual stars of the film coming out and talking about flaws in these films. Not only do I feel like everyone is finally catching on to what I've been saying for a very long time,
Man, I'm tired of being right.
but I have a sneaking suspicion that this won't be the last time that we hear from someone who has had negative experiences with Marvel movies as people get more and more comfortable with sharing their true feelings. The tides may finally be changing, and when that happens, the truth will finally be revealed. So let me know what you thought about all this in the comments down below. As always, please like, comment, share, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, and I'll see you next time right here on Real Shift. Thanks for watching. Peace out.
Y'all be cool. Right on.